The neon lights of the "Open 24/7" sign cast an eerie glow, flickering sporadically against the backdrop of the deserted highway that stretched endlessly in both directions. The gas station stood solitary amidst the vast expanse, a lone beacon of civilization in the midst of nowhere. Daniel, a tall, lanky man in his late 20s, pulled into the station's parking lot in his battered sedan. With a weary sigh, he stepped out, locking the car behind him. His sneakers crunched on the gravel as he made his way towards the small convenience store adjoining the gas pumps. Dressed in a faded uniform that had seen better days, Daniel adjusted his name tag and ran a hand through his messy dark hair as he pushed open the glass door, a little bell chiming above him. The familiar, slightly musty scent of the store greeted him, mingling with the aroma of cheap coffee brewing in the corner. The interior of the gas station was bathed in the harsh, artificial light of fluorescent bulbs, casting stark shadows among the aisles of snacks and travel necessities. Daniel moved behind the counter, preparing for his overnight shift. Methodically, he began wiping the counter, his movements mechanical and routine. His eyes, however, were drawn to the large glass windows that looked out onto the pumps and the ominous dark highway beyond. Outside, the night was pitch black, the darkness only broken by the station's lights and the intermittent flickering of the neon sign. The woods beyond seemed to encroach upon the small oasis of light, their shadows stretching out like long, grasping fingers. A gust of wind rustled the few leaves scattered on the ground, creating fleeting, whispering sounds that added to the eerie ambiance. Daniel shivered involuntarily. Though he had worked this shift countless times before, tonight felt different. An inexplicable chill ran down his spine, and he couldn't shake off a strange feeling of foreboding that seemed to hang in the air. He tried to dismiss the uneasy feeling, attributing it to the isolation in the late hour. Still, as he busied himself with restocking shelves and checking inventory, he couldn't quite manage to shake the sense that tonight, something was off. The gas station sat like an island in a sea of darkness, isolated and seemingly adrift from the rest of the world. On one side, dense woods stood like silent sentinels, their twisted branches intertwining to form an almost impenetrable barrier. Shadows played within the depths of the forest, creating the illusion of movement where there was none. The wind whistled through the leaves, conjuring eerie melodies that seemed to whisper secrets of the night. On the opposite side, the empty highway stretched out like a desolate ribbon, disappearing into the horizon. Its asphalt surface, slick from an earlier rain, reflected the sporadic glow of the station's lights. The road lay dormant, as though waiting for some unknown traveler to disturb its slumber. Inside the small convenience store, the buzzing of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed unnaturally loud in the silence, their monotonous drone a jarring reminder of the isolation. The lights flickered occasionally, casting transient shadows that danced across the aisles lined with snacks, magazines, and travel supplies. Every so often, the quiet was punctuated by the distant rumble of a passing truck, its sounds growing from a murmur to a roar before diminishing once again, leaving behind an even more profound silence. Daniel, standing behind the counter, tried to focus on his routine tasks. He sorted through a stack of receipts and adjusted the display of candy bars near the register. Yet, despite his efforts to immerse himself in the mundane, his mind kept drifting back to the unsettling quiet outside. He tried to shake off his unease, telling himself it was just the isolated nature of his surroundings playing tricks on his mind. The gas station, though secluded, was familiar territory to him. He had spent countless nights manning the counter, watching the occasional late-night customer come and go, and navigating through the hours until dawn. However, tonight felt different. The shadows seemed denser, the silence more oppressive, and the isolation more pronounced. A nagging sense of anxiety tugged at the corners of Daniel's mind, a feeling he couldn't quite pinpoint or shake off. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves and dismiss the unsettling thoughts that threatened to spiral into paranoia. As the clock ticked onward, the night outside deepened into an impenetrable darkness that seemed to envelop the gas station. The overhead lights cast a small oasis of illumination amidst the sea of shadows, but that oasis seemed to be shrinking incrementally, as if the darkness was pressing in from all sides. As Daniel went about his duties, restocking shelves and doing inventory, he couldn't help but notice odd movements at the corners of his eyes. Shadows seemed to flicker and dance in his peripheral vision, brief and elusive. One moment there would be nothing, and the next a brief glimpse of something shifting, something out of place. It was like a visual whisper, seen but not entirely grasped. Every time he tried to focus on these strange movements, turning his head quickly or attempting to catch them in the act, they would disappear as swiftly as they had come. The aisles, filled with neatly organized merchandise, would be still and ordinary, as if mocking his expectations of the uncanny. Initially, Daniel laughed it off. He scolded himself for letting the isolation and the late hour get to his head. "You're seeing things," he muttered under his breath, attempting to inject some logic into the situation. He attributed the fleeting shadows to his tired eyes playing tricks on him, or perhaps to the occasional flickering of the gas station's less than reliable lighting. Trying to dismiss his growing paranoia, he focused on the monotonous tasks at hand. He wiped down the counters, counted the cash in the register, and straightened the magazines that lay haphazardly on the shelves. Yet, despite his efforts to ground himself in the mundane, the sense of unease continued to grow. The hours seemed to stretch interminably before him, each minute dragging on longer than the last. The silence of the gas station seemed to amplify every small noise, turning the hum of the refrigerator or the creaking of the building settling into ominous sounds. The shadows continued their elusive dance, teasing at the edges of his consciousness. It became a game of sorts, a macabre hide-and-seek that Daniel didn't remember signing up for. He tried to keep his focus, reminding himself that it was just a product of his imagination, fueled by the solitary environment. But as the night progressed, the flickering shadows became more persistent, making it increasingly difficult for Daniel to shake off the sense that something was amiss. As the hands of the clock crept towards midnight, the quiet outside was suddenly interrupted by the sound of a car engine. The headlights cut through the darkness like twin beams of reality in a nightmarish landscape, momentarily banishing the shadows that seemed to be encroaching upon the gas station. Daniel, grateful for the distraction, looked up from the counter where he was aimlessly flipping through a magazine. The car, an old and worn-out sedan that had clearly seen better days, pulled up to one of the pumps with a weary sigh of its engine. The door opened and a woman stepped out. She was of medium height, with disheveled brown hair that hung around her face in exhausted strands. Her eyes, wide and darting, scanned the surroundings with a frantic urgency that made Daniel's own heart rate quicken in response. Her clothes were rumpled, as if she had been driving for a long time, and her hands shook slightly as she fumbled with the gas pump. Daniel stepped outside, deciding to offer assistance. As he approached, he could see her face more clearly in the dim light provided by the station's canopy. She looked to be in her 30s, but the lines of worry on her face seemed to age her prematurely. "Hey, do you need help with that?" he called out, trying to sound friendly and unintrusive. The woman jumped slightly at his voice, her eyes snapping to meet his. "Oh no, I've got it, thanks," she stammered, her voice shaky. She paused for a moment before adding in a hurried whisper, I've been seeing strange things on the road tonight." Her eyes, wide and fearful, conveyed a story of their own. Daniel, picking up on her discomfort, tried to offer a comforting smile. "It's a dark night," he offered lamely. "Easy to imagine things." She nodded, but her agitation was palpable. She didn't elaborate on what she'd seen, and Daniel didn't press her. Within a few minutes, she had finished pumping gas, paid in hurried cash, and was back in her car. The engine revved and the car sped away, leaving behind a cloud of dust and a sense of lingering unease. Daniel stood there for a moment, watching the car's taillights disappear into the night. The woman's fear, her darting eyes, and her hasty exit added another layer of tension to the already oppressive atmosphere. He found himself wondering what she had seen on the road that had left her in such a state. Her words seemed to echo in his mind, amplifying his own experiences with the flickering shadows. He shook his head, trying to clear it of the burgeoning paranoia. "Just a spooked traveler," he mumbled to himself, attempting to rationalize the encounter. But as he turned back to the gas station, he couldn't help but feel that the night had taken a turn. The woman's fear had been contagious, and the shadows seemed to loom even larger now, tinged with an unseen threat that left Daniel feeling exposed and vulnerable. He retreated back into the artificial light of the gas station's interior, but the encounter had left him rattled, and the once mundane surroundings now seemed charged with an eerie anticipation. Not long after the woman's departure, the atmosphere within the gas station began to shift further. Daniel tried to refocus on his tasks, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the nervous woman and the unseen horrors she might have encountered on the desolate highway. He attempted to distract himself by rearranging some products on the shelves and wiping down the counters. However, his attempts at finding normalcy were abruptly thwarted. The overhead lights, which had been steady and bright all evening, began to flicker intermittently. At first, it was just a subtle, brief dimming, but soon it escalated into a stroboscopic dance of light and shadow that made the small space feel disorienting and unstable. The hum of the refrigerator units seemed to grow louder and more insistent, as if mirroring the increasing tempo of Daniel's heartbeat. Simultaneously, the rustling from the woods surrounding the gas station became more pronounced. What had once sounded like the harmless movements of nocturnal animals now took on a more sinister tone. The sounds were too loud, too deliberate, as if something or someone was moving through the underbrush with intent, rather than natural curiosity. Inside the station, unexplainable happenings escalated. Products that had been securely placed on the shelves inexplicably toppled over, clattering to the floor in a cacophony of plastic and cardboard. A can of soda rolled across the floor, propelled by an unseen force, stopping at Daniel's feet. He picked it up, his hands trembling slightly, and scanned the area for any explanation. And then there were the shadows. Before, they had been fleeting, ephemeral things that darted away the moment he tried to focus on them, but now they seemed to have grown bolder, more tangible. They lingered at the edges of his vision, dark shapes that seemed to mock his disbelief with their blatant defiance of the light. Even when he stared directly at them, they remained elongated, undulating patches of darkness that seemed to pulse with an eerie life of their own. Daniel's breath quickened, and his skin prickled with a cold sweat. Rational explanations were growing scarce, and the oppressive feeling of being watched, being targeted, settled heavily upon him. He felt exposed, like a lone actor on a stage, aware that every movement was being observed from the shadowed wings. His mind raced to make sense of what was happening, to attribute the strange occurrences to tiredness or mere coincidence. Yet, the undeniable reality of the situation loomed before him, challenging his grip on reason and logic. The gas station, his sanctuary of mundanity and routine, had transformed into a theater of the inexplicable and bizarre. With every passing minute, a deep-rooted dread tightened its grip on Daniel. The once familiar hum of the refrigerator units and the ticking of the old clock above the counter now sounded distorted, amplifying his heightened sense of reality. Each echo and distant creak of the building seemed to taunt him, playing on the fragile edges of his nerves. Every corner of the dimly lit room seemed to conceal a lurking menace, the shadows dancing with malevolent intent. The gas station, which had been his refuge from the world outside, offering the simplicity of late-night shifts and predictable tasks, now betrayed him. The linoleum floors felt colder underfoot, and the fluorescent lights, with their unpredictable flickering, cast eerie patterns across the walls, making the space seem distorted and unfamiliar. The rows of candy bars, chips, and magazines appeared foreign, transformed by the looming dread into potential threats. The once clear boundaries of the room blurred, with walls appearing to inch closer, creating a suffocating cocoon around him. Their once neutral beige paint now took on a darker hue, deepening his sense of entrapment. The windows, which usually offered a view of the open highway and freedom, were now smeared with a grimy film, distorting the outside world and leaving Daniel feeling isolated in his growing panic. The shadows, once mere trickeries of light and dark, seemed to take on a life of their own. They slithered and swayed, stretching longer and growing darker, their edges sharp and defined. Each movement was calculated, as if they were sentient beings reveling in his terror, delighting in the game of cat and mouse they played with him. A chill ran down Daniel's spine, and his heart pounded loudly in his chest, echoing the rapid drumming of his thoughts. His breathing grew shallow, and the weight of his fear threatened to cripple him. He felt on the verge of a breakdown, the surrealness of his situation pushing him to question not only his surroundings, but his very grasp on reality. The gas station, once a backdrop to his ordinary life, had morphed into a nightmarish realm, and Daniel felt he was teetering on the brink of an abyss. As Daniel's frantic gaze darted around the gas station, desperately seeking some semblance of normality amidst the chaos, his hand brushed against an old, dusty object tucked away under the counter. Curiosity momentarily piercing through the fog of his panic, he reached down and pulled out a worn, leather-bound journal. It was aged and forgotten, its cover cracked and stained from years of neglect. The corners were frayed, and the once vibrant color of the leather had faded to a dull brown. A small lock dangled uselessly to one side, having been broken long ago. With trembling hands, Daniel opened the journal, the pages whispering secrets as he flipped through them. The handwriting was erratic, the ink smeared in places where the writer's hand had perhaps quivered with emotion. Daniel's eyes scanned the entries, and a cold realization settled over him. The words on the pages mirrored his own experiences. The same shadows, the same unsettling noises, and the same oppressive fear that now clung to the very air of the gas station. The journal belonged to a previous worker, someone who had endured the same eerie happenings in this isolated outpost. The entries began casually enough, mundane recounts of daily tasks and occasional customers. But as the pages turned, the tone shifted dramatically. Scribbled sentences spoke of shadows flickering in the darkness and strange sounds emanating from the woods. The writer described nights filled with paranoia, the oppressive atmosphere, and a terror that gnawed at his sanity. Every word resonated with Daniel, each description echoing his own ordeal. He flipped through the pages voraciously, seeking answers, seeking an end to the story that felt so much like his own. The journal became a testament of shared fear, a silent companion validating his nightmarish reality. As he reached the final entries, the writing grew more desperate and erratic. Ink blotches stained the pages where the pen had been pressed too hard in frantic writing. The worker wrote of a resolution, a final confrontation he had planned. The words were charged with a mix of determination and dread. The writer expressed an intent to face the shadows that haunted the gas station, to challenge the darkness that had upturned his life. The journal ended abruptly, with no conclusion or resolution penned down. The last page bore only a few hastily scrawled words, expressing a hope that confronting the shadows would bring an end to the terror. The final sentence trailed off, leaving an eerie void that sent a fresh wave of chills down Daniel's spine. Daniel sat there, the journal open in his hands, his heart pounding with a mix of empathy and fear. He realized he wasn't alone in his experiences, but the abrupt ending and the unknown fate of the previous worker left him with more questions than answers. The journal, a silent witness to the gas station's eerie past, now rested in his hands, binding him to a legacy of shadows and fear. A surge of adrenaline coursed through Daniel's veins as he reached the pivotal decision. He couldn't bear the oppressive fear any longer, and the unanswered questions from the journal only fueled his resolve. The shadows, which had tormented him and the previous worker alike, had to be confronted. He was desperate for answers, desperate for a resolution that the journal's author never seemed to find. His hands trembled as he reached for the flashlight behind the counter. It was an ordinary tool, its metallic surface cold and reassuring in his clammy grip. He tested the switch, and a beam of light sliced through the dim interior of the gas station. The intensity of the light seemed to embolden him, providing a stark contrast against the shadows that danced menacingly at the edges of his vision. Taking a deep breath, Daniel steeled himself and approached the entrance. The glass door loomed before him like a gateway to another realm, separating the known from the unknown. His hand hovered over the door handle for a moment, doubt and fear gnawing at the edges of his mind. But the desperation to end this nightmare overpowered his hesitation, and he pushed the door open, stepping out into the cool night air. The gas station's exterior was bathed in an eerie half-light, with the station's few functioning lights casting pools of illumination on the concrete. Beyond these islands of light, the shadows seemed to congregate and whisper, dark tendrils flickering like an ethereal mist. The dense woods flanking the station rustled ominously, and the deserted highway stretched endlessly in both directions. Daniel's heart raced in his chest, pounding in rhythm with the quick, shallow breaths he took. The night was alive with sounds that he hadn't noticed before, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves, and the soft whispers of the wind. Each sound seemed magnified, contributing to the symphony of the night that now played all around him. Gripping the flashlight like a lifeline, Daniel ventured forward, his beam of light cutting through the darkness. Every shadow seemed to move, to recoil and then surge forward again, creating an illusion of being surrounded. He felt like an intruder in this nocturnal world, a lone player on a stage set by forces he couldn't comprehend. As he approached the shifting darkness, where the shadows seemed thickest, a sense of foreboding settled over him. His footsteps echoed eerily in the silence, a staccato accompaniment to the pounding of his heart. Each step took him closer to the unknown, to the shadows that seemed almost sentient in their dance. Despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm him, there was a spark of determination within Daniel. He needed to know. He needed to understand what was happening. Armed with nothing more than a flashlight and his own desperation, he faced the shifting darkness head-on, ready to confront whatever secrets it held. The moment the beam of light touched the dancing, ethereal forms, a tangible change swept through the environment. The shadows, which until now had seemed almost sentient in their deliberate movements, cringed away from the intrusion of light. They writhed and twisted before dissipating like smoke in a gust of wind. It was as if the light had severed their tether to this place, banishing them back to whatever realm they had emerged from. The gas station, once feeling like a nightmarish trap, underwent a startling transformation. The air, which had been thick with tension and unspoken fear, now seemed lighter and clearer. The oppressive atmosphere that had gripped the place lifted, as though a heavy curtain had been drawn back, revealing the mundane reality beneath. The fluorescent lights inside the station flickered back to their steady hum, casting their pale, sterile light across the familiar interior. The sounds from the woods returned to normal, the natural rustle of leaves and the distant calls of nocturnal creatures. The highway lay silent and deserted, bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights. As the night wore on, Daniel found himself in a state of surreal calm. The earlier chaos seemed like a distant memory, a nightmare from which he had just awakened. He went about his duties mechanically, restocking the shelves and cleaning up the mess that the unexplained phenomena had caused. But his mind was elsewhere, trying to piece together the bizarre occurrences. Had it been real? Or was it simply a product of his overworked, isolated mind, conjuring up phantasms to break the monotony? The gas station was back to its familiar self, the everyday sanctuary of routine and predictability that Daniel had come to rely upon. But something had shifted, something intangible yet profoundly unsettling. He found himself questioning everything, every flicker of light, every subtle movement in the darkness outside. It all seemed to hold a deeper, darker meaning. He replayed the night's events over and over in his mind, trying to make sense of the shadows that had seemed so real, so threatening. As dawn approached and the first hints of sunlight began to break over the horizon, Daniel was left alone with his thoughts. The gas station, now bathed in the soft, comforting light of day, seemed entirely ordinary. The shadows were gone, and with them, the palpable sense of fear they had brought. Yet, despite the return to normalcy, Daniel couldn't shake off the experience. He was left with a lingering sense of uncertainty, a nagging question that refused to be silenced. Had he truly faced some otherworldly presence, or had his mind played tricks on him in his isolation? The night passed without any further incident, and as Daniel prepared to hand over the shift to the morning attendant, he found himself grappling with his own skepticism and belief. The gas station stood there, as it always had, a beacon of normalcy amidst the deserted highway and dense woods. But for Daniel, it would never be the same again. He was left to wonder and question, with no answers in sight, and the memory of the night's encounter etched indelibly in his mind. Daniel, profoundly shaken by that eerie night, promptly quit his nocturnal shifts at the gas station. He couldn't bear the thought of another confrontation with the shadows, and the once comforting routine had lost its charm. The nights were now tinged with an inexplicable fear, and the gas station seemed to hold secrets that were best left undiscovered. In the subsequent months, the gas station changed ownership multiple times. New workers came and went, each experiencing their own share of strange occurrences during the graveyard shift. Whispers circulated among the locals, tales of unexplainable shadows, sudden chills, and objects moving of their own accord. These stories, dismissed by some as mere products of overactive imaginations, gained traction and became part of the town's lore. The gas station, once just a nondescript stop along a deserted highway, slowly morphed into a place shrouded in mystery and intrigue. People spoke in hushed tones about the haunted station, and teenagers dared each other to venture there late at night, hoping to catch a glimpse of the supernatural. The story of the mysterious shadows and the night of terror experienced by a lone worker ended up becoming a local legend. It was embellished and retold, each iteration adding new elements to the tale. Some spoke of ghostly apparitions, while others believed it to be a hotspot for extraterrestrial activity. Amidst all the speculation and storytelling, the truth of that night was known only to Daniel. He kept a low profile, avoiding any mention of the gas station and the chilling events he had witnessed. Yet, even in the safety of daylight and the comfort of his new routine, he couldn't escape the haunting memories. Whenever he found himself alone in the dark or caught sight of a flickering light, the memories would come rushing back. He would see in his mind's eye the shadows that had lurked just at the periphery of his vision, feeling again the cold grip of fear that had seized him that night. He still shuddered at the recollection, a silent witness to a mystery that remained unresolved. Daniel knew he had touched the fringes of something beyond comprehension, something that lingered in the shadows, just out of sight. The gas station continued to stand, a mute testament to the strange happenings, its secrets known only to him, and the silent night that concealed them.